it's a real privilege and honor to be here. I love what you're doing. It's a great course, and it's really, exciting what you're doing. Before we start, I just want to honor a great elder who passed away this morning, Arnold Mindell, who's informed so much of my work and my life. I mean, it's quite an emotional day today because, he held so much for so many people and initiated so many people into real being free spirits and really living their lives with, real awareness and deep training. So I'm very touched to have a little picture of Arnie here with a little candle. So hopefully he'll be with us in spirit. I have no doubt he was an eternal student. He's always willing to learn. Not that I could teach him much. Most of this has come from him. So anyway, I just start my story today. I see my dear friend Russell Thornton's on the call today from New Zealand. We met first in 1978, and he went to live in a Buddhist monastery, and I followed him at one point for a 2-day visit and ended up staying almost 3 years. But during the time in that monastery, I had a mystical experience, which then led to an extreme state. I was in that extreme state for about 2 years, the epicenter of it. And it was like a complete encounter of heaven and hell. It was like a Kundalini awakening. It was a tantric college. I took all the lower tantras, so I was hedging my bets. I didn't want to kind of go too fast, too quick, but it happened anyway. And I've been working through that for since 1986. I became a therapist because I thought I've got myself through this. Stanislav and Christina Grof hadn't written their book at that time. So there was no real reference points for it apart from Jung, but the Red Book hadn't been published then. But I thought I ought to become a therapist because I'd taken myself through quite a journey. And when I was an occupational therapist working in psychological therapies in psychiatry, and one of the key people in my training for inspiration was Arnold Mindell, who was a physicist and a Jungian analyst, who then developed something called process-oriented psychology. And there's many teachers in that community I can sort of pay homage to, but there are 2 other notable ones, as well as Amy and Arnie, which is Jean-Claude and Arlene Ortegon, who used to go and run process work seminars in a psychiatric unit. And it was the most incredible work that they did. And it emboldened me and another colleague, friend of mine, Helen Wells, and we started to introduce that into the trust where we were working. And so it became a real sense of, working on the edge. And I'll go into a little bit about that work as I go through the talk. But a seminal book for me in this work was Arnie Mindell's City Shadows. I mean, basically, it's a book that deals with the unprocessed trauma and extreme states that are in the collective. And because they're not being processed, people end up in a psychiatric unit, but the medicalization of these states means consensus reality has taken a very reductionist view and very pathology based. But of course, myself and Helen and others who were trying to do something a bit different realized that we were taking a transpersonal perspective, working from a holistic narrative, and were process orientated rather than pathology based. So it kind of was always an interesting clash in some ways, but we managed to hold our space, and we did I think some pretty good work. We had a publication in 2006 where we challenged the narrative around illness or individuation. And of course, we plumped for people who are in an individuation process. We weren't talking about recovery from illness. We were talking about recovery to wholeness. And we got that published in Psychotherapy and Politics International in 2006. I'm really proud of that piece of work because, it kind of sums up a lot of the journey. But prior to that, in 1999, which is now 25 years ago, I wrote 2 papers on quantum questions in psychiatry. And I wrote them because I felt there's something needs to be said here about what's being missed, i.e., it felt like we were being very Newtonian. Now, I love Newton, by the way, because he was an alchemist. So, don't think he was a reductionist. He wasn't. But the way he's been sort of used in the current worldview is quite sort of reductionistic in that sense of cause and effect. But, in those papers, I looked at Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where light and matter behave as particles and waves. And what that means is there's an indeterminacy in the process because you can't track the velocity and the position of a particle at any given time, because it can also be a wave. Oh my God, where's it gone? And so we're now talking about a field. So if we haven't got the parts that are bouncing off each other and the particle then can be a wave, that opens up a whole new narrative. If this is the subtle reality at a microscopic level, what does that mean for all of us in the way we're living? So those two papers were addressing that, and I drew heavily on Arnie Mindell's work because he was a physicist and a psychologist. So for me, the quantum reality aligned to wholeness. And this was a real key thing for me, because I thought if we're dealing with change and supporting people through traumas and extreme states, surely wholeness has to be our guiding principle, our pilot light, as it were. And in some ways, we have support from that from physicists like Wolfgang Pauli. He was a colleague of Werner Heisenberg, a Nobel Prize winning physicist. And he said that the spirit of matter has been lost since the scientific revolution in the 16th century. And, this is a key statement, because the spirit of matter, what's going on in a statement like that? Well, for my money, when the Red Book got published in 2009, and I went straight to that, trust me, that was on my shelf very quickly. I got the big edition, but trying to read it, I got a repetitive strain injury, so I had to buy the reader's version as well. So somebody's got some good marketing ploys out there. I couldn't hold it. I was getting... Anyway, in there, he talks about the Geist der Tiefe, the spirit of the depths. And he said that's been lost because of our over-rational culture that's developed in this kind of post-industrial age that we're in now, and prior to that, the Industrial Revolution. So the spirit of the depths has been lost, and the spirit of the matter's off the radar. So what does that suggest to us about what we're trying to reach into when we think about what it means to be a human with these underlying, if you wish, philosophies? Fritjof Capra, the Tao of Physics, pops to mind as well. So the cost, I believe, to us is our current one-sidedness. It's an unbalanced materialism and individualism. And I did my PhD on the global crisis as a spiritual crisis. And essentially, I argued in that and previous papers that I had published that unless we address the global crisis as a spiritual crisis, there'll be an escalation in extreme states of consciousness. Now, we might think that's terrible, but if we looked at Jung, he would say, not so bad, because we also know through his teachings on enantiodromia, when a process gets too one-sided, nature, the natural process is for a tendency to flip back and redress the balance. So an increase in extreme states and altered states of consciousness are a breaking through, not a breaking down, using the old adage. So I started to look at, and this is in the Unselfish Spirit, the first book, that we're living in a time of the Anthropocene, but if we're not careful, we just become prisoners in that state, in that place of, oh, here's the state of degradation, a time of degradation. What shall we do? Oh my God, let's problem solve. What do? We change who we are, because we are part of that problem, and we've lost the spirit of the depths and the spirit in matter. We've become too one-sided. So if we're not careful, we become prisoners in the Anthropocene, trying to iron out a narrative that actually can't be straightened. So in my second book, The Visionary Spirit, I wrote about that we can become pilgrims in a transformacene. This is a time of restoration. And what I mean by the transformacene is there are two Italian words derived. Transformo is one word for change, and scene is a new era. So a new era of change. But what's in that change? This is the key thing. And for my money, it's a shift towards transpersonal consciousness. This is what we need to wake up to. This is the enantiodromia, if you wish. If we pick it up, if we put the sails up on our Norfolk Wherry, which is a lovely old boat, and let the wind of change catch that, and we then use that, guide that process, then I think we're actually going to be doing some good work. But there are a couple of things we need to be aware of. The first one is we've got to be careful of our dualistic thinking. the subject-object polarities that we get caught in, the ego-other projections that happen. What's being called for, in my estimation, is unity. And that's more of an omnijective state, not a subject or an object, but omnijective, all. And I first came across that term in Michael Talbot's book, Mysticism and the New Physics, which is a very old book, but it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So if we consult then another great physicist who worked with Einstein, David Bohm, he talks about the field of unbroken wholeness. And that comes from his book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And there he suggests that we're all enfolded in nature as one, but we're all unfolding from that oneness. So there's an enfoldment and an unfolding. And a really good way of appreciating this sense of wholeness and what it means to our perspectives for living is the hologram. You'll know there's a holographic plate. And let's say we have on that holographic plate the image of a human being, and we snap off the right foot. And I've got a picture of the right foot on this holographic plate. If I pass a laser beam of light through that image of the foot, that coherent light, that means the photons are working in synthesis. It's called a Bose-Einstein condensate. If that light goes through that photographic plate, the whole image of that hologram will appear. So the part can't be separated from the whole. So now we understand that this is the, if you wish, the philosophical and the physics, the underpinning for the kind of shifts in consciousness that we're talking about. The whole is in the part. So another element within this, if we really want to get into the juice of the quantum revolution, I'm not a quantum physicist, I'm not a physicist, I'm not even that type of scientist. I've got a medical background as a professions allied to medicine. So yeah, but I like reading, you know, so I'm entitled to say a little bit. And if I've got it wrong, then somebody will tell me. But we're talking about a non-local field. Now, here in my local world, people know me in the street as Mick, and they know the street I'm on, and they'll knock on the door, and that'll be a local interaction. But in non-local particle physics, there's something called quantum entanglement. And this has been shown in research that if you have two particles, and one is in Tokyo and the other one's in Brisbane, and those particles are connected, the minute one spins and the spin changes on one of those particles, the other one changes instantaneously, not at some point, both at the same time. So they are intimately connected, and that change happens faster than the speed of light. Now, I think Einstein was a little bit perplexed by all this, but because his theory was relativity theory. But it shows us something now about this world that we're in, which is very sensitive to these kind of movements and this whole connectivity of what we're living in. Now, this is where it gets really juicy, because Jung came up with a concept called synchronicity. And I can bet you everyone in this call will have had an experience where something like they're thinking of a friend you haven't spoken to for X amount of years, and then the phone rings and it's them, you know, or something like that. We've all had that. But how does it work then? Well, who can say really? But the best guess we've got at the moment is that an inner psychological reality meets an outer physical experience. That seems to be a bit of a consensus for what's going on there, which means there's a mind-matter connection. And don't forget within this as well, that Jung's work was all about soul retrieval. So it's not just about being clever little connections going on. This is about soul retrieval and deepening our soul work. Wolfgang Pauli, who I mentioned earlier, also went into Jungian analysis. He sort of got interested in Jung's work because Jung came up with synchronicity. Pauli went into analysis, and he had loads of vivid dreams. And he had a dream once of Einstein, who told him that the missing dimension of reality is the unconscious. Now, I think this is wonderful, because all of a sudden, you know, whether it's now started to confirm what Jung's saying, and Jung's kind of going where Pauli's going, this is getting great. But he also had a vision where he said there's going to be a return of the soul to the world. So this is really wonderful, because that, again, that missing spirit in matter, that missing soul connection. And if you want to have a real, this is really where it gets wonderful, I think, this little symbol here. that's the symbol of psychology. It's also the symbol in physics of the wave function. It's also Poseidon's, what do you call it? Trident. And that trident, Poseidon is the god of the in the water, so the ocean is often the unconscious. It's also the trident of Shiva, which brings in the divine, the destruction and creation, this wonderful interface. So there's something, I believe at CERN, where they've got a picture of Shiva, they've got a big statue of Shiva at CERN. No reason to suspect that's an accident. There's a lot that can be said here. So what we've got to remember is synchronicities cluster around times when we're going through deep transformations. And one of the most vivid ways of looking at this, so I mean, Wolfgang Pauli was a genius. Einstein said, this guy is amazing. Well, when he went into the laboratory working on the stuff he was working on, some machines would start blowing up, you know? I mean, it was just like, this is like a real confirmation that he's onto something. So, you know, I kind of love this idea of, you know, test tubes blasting all over the place and everyone's going, oh, I think scientists got phobic about working with Pauli because, you know, like what's going to blow up next? But if you want a real powerful illustration for synchronicity, a professor of biology, Adolf Portman, was doing a lecture on biology, on a subject of biology, and he wanted to conclude his lecture with a story about a praying mantis. At that very moment, a praying mantis flew into the auditorium, sat on the lectern where the projector was, and showed itself on the screen in a prayerful position. That's a powerful story. These are things that you just think, what? The chances of that? If you went down the bookies and put a bet on that, you know, I wonder what the odds would be. So we've got to now think about, what does this mean? What does this quantum revelation mean in light of psychology and where we're going in terms of this change, this enantiodromia that I spoke about? Well, interestingly, Jung included the paranormal in his understanding of synchronicity. Now, isn't that wonderful? So if you think about all the ways we understand that, and by the way, Allan Kardec, who wrote a book called The Medium's Book, we haven't just got clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, all the various ways, about 4 or 5 ways. Kardec stretches it way off the scale. There's loads more. So he basically says that we all have these mediumistic tendencies, every one of us. It's why we're having synchronicities or dreams that seem to sometimes come true, or at least start to bear fruit in reality. My question is, where is that part of our untapped potential for evolving our consciousness and going further with trusting that, rather than it being cut off as being, say, well, this is woo-woo because it's not scientific enough? And I'll come to that in a little bit with some good stories. I wanted to share 3 basic stories, very quick ones from my own experience to bring in some context here for where I've been going in my life. When I went to my first process work seminar in '96 with Max Schubach and Jutta Vickersloh, we were sitting in a circle in Oxford. I didn't really get much chance to interact with anyone because we were there just for the introduction in the Friday evening, and then we were all going to get our brief, chat about the weekend, go off to our accommodation, start on Saturday. I remember seeing people's faces and thinking, oh, you know, nice people. Went home, went to the hotel, slept, and I had a dream of one of the participants, Iona Friedenberg, who's still a good friend of mine. And she and her partner, Ra, they popped up in my dream, and I knew they were healers. And they also had a giant nut that they needed to show us. So I thought, this is kind of, yeah, wow, what a dream. So in the morning, Max said, anyone have a dream? I said, yes, I dreamt of that lady over there, and she had a giant nut. And she looked like shocked, and she opened her rucksack and pulled out a giant Coco de Mer seed. And it transpired that she had left the seminar the previous night, went to her friend Cheryl's house, and then saw the Coco de Mer and said, can I take that to the seminar in the morning? And I dreamt that. And then we met in the morning, and lo and behold, there was the nut, you know, or the seed. But it was just beautiful. That cemented our friendship. So the next one I want to talk about is a very dear friend of mine, Anne. And this one's quite moving. And I hadn't seen her for 3 months at the time. And I had this really powerful dream about her. And the dream was she was with a woman, and she was in a sort of quite it looked like a lot of emotion, and we hugged, and I went into an altered state, and then we danced, and it was like some psychedelic waltz. And I thought, wow. And I woke up in the morning. I thought, I must tell Anne what's just happened. But before I got to the phone, she rang me. We hadn't spoke for 3 months. She phoned me and said, oh, would you like to come to a party tonight? And I said, well, funny you say that. I've got something to tell you. I dreamt about you last night. Anyway, we met at the party, and I told Anne the dream, and then I believe we did a little psychedelic dance there. And then you and Anne was wearing a lovely pink fluffy coat, and we did this little dance. And anyway, Anne said, because at that time she was just going through lots of tests for a potential health condition that she was looking at, which was quite emotional. And she said it felt very comforting because that night when I dreamt of her, she had been in a very difficult place emotionally, feeling a lot of pain around what was happening. And she said it felt like now she knew somebody was with her. And I was technically, because I was in the dreaming with her. And then I went back home that night and did a meditation in front of Tara and had a clear light experience for herself. And it changed part of her direction. So there's something about this joining together and having conversations with each other and finding out what this means, rather than just saying I had a weird dream, I won't tell anyone, or laughing about it, taking it seriously. The last one I want to tell you is quite powerful for me because it's a personal one where I dreamt just before I started becoming a process work student. You had to take a dream to see if that was relevant for you to come on the training. And I had a dream of a really powerful snake, a big black snake, and out of its mouth came this white snake. And I thought, I don't know, that felt really strong and powerful. Snakes, Kundalini, the cult of Asclepius, transformation, shedding of the skin, it had all those connotations and associations. Anyway, I got on the training. It wasn't until 2009 when I got the red book, and I read that 4 times. There's a sequence in there where there's a crucified figure, and a dark snake goes into the anus of the crucified figure, but it comes out of the mouth white. And then all of a sudden I thought, that's an archetype. Here's the archetypes. I had no idea because Red Book had never been published. I had no access to that. Here's an archetype. This is what it looks like. This is powerful. So taking those deep, deep connections seriously. And of course, that's been ongoing work for me for many, many years. So what am I saying then? I said, well, I haven't said it yet. We're living in of what John Wheeler, the physicist, called the physics of a participatory universe. This isn't just a random universe. It participates. Think of those particles that are in alignment. Think of synchronicities that are coming alive with each other. But my question is, what does it mean to participate in this universe? And I've had a few thoughts about that, and I'm sure you will too. But as I'm doing the speech, I'll tell you what mine are. I believe it's about participating in the restoration of wholeness, because we are in a field of wholeness, but we've become separate and discombobulated and all those things. So this is about getting back to that sense of wholeness. And there's 2 ways that I'd like to conceptualize that just in the moment. The first is through one way that we can get back to that wholeness is through the illustrations I've just given you, which is about meaningful coincidences, these acausal synchronistic connections, which are, of course, about union. They bring things into union if we have the wherewithal to understand that. The next one is the meaningful relationships that can lead to communion, so that we're then relating in wholeness with each other and to each other. So this is a field for me of sacred resonances. We're vibrational beings in a vibrational cosmos. We can get that through color. If I see a rainbow, I know damn well that all the gradations of color are different energetic frequencies and vibrations. I get the same with sound. We can even bring that in mythically. In the beginning was the word, and the word was Om, or something like that. So we know that this field, this sacred field, is what we should be tackling first and foremost. I've written extensively about this in peer-reviewed papers and 3 books, and I feel this is the work that we must do. You know, there's so much good work going on in this world of deep change and multiple crises, but this is a pivotal and an essential point that we need to get working on. So let's bring in the mystics. We've already done that because Jung and Pauli were mystics, and Arnie Mindell. But Ram Dass, who I adore, he's such a good teacher, well, was and still is a good teacher. He was talking to the quantum physicist Richard Feynman, who famously Nobel Prize winner. He came up with the idea of quantum electrodynamics. By the way, Feynman was Arnie Mindell's teacher at the Californian University of California, which is wonderful. So nice to have some synchronicities going on there, coherences. And Ram Dass was talking to Richard Feynman about his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, his ability to bilocate. And Richard Feynman said, no, that's not possible. That cannot happen. And Ram Dass said, well, it did. Not prove it. He just, well, it did, I mean, because, that people were with Maharaji all the time. And then his other followers say, well, he's just turned up in Delhi, and yet he was in this place. Now, we could say that's an isolated case, but we know from the mystics of every tradition, the Sufis, the Tibetan Buddhists, the indigenous elders in these various traditions, Black Elk, these things happen across the board. So where I get a little bit sort of perplexed is quantum theory is used to speculate about the eventual teleportation of humans, and we get really excited about that. But we don't get excited about bilocation, which is happening all over the place. And, we don't need any physics apparatus. We've just got to really go deep into our prayer life, into our consciousness. And these graces are the byproduct of that. So, but that's for another debate. But if by coming out with stuff like that and aligning it to quantum physics, what you get these days is you're labeled quantum woo. Now, I've written about woo woo, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but I think actually that is just a very limited and very sad mindset if we're going to stick with that. So if we think about, I've mentioned saints from the Hindu tradition, the Tibetan tradition, the Sufi tradition, and it happens in the Christian tradition. Saint Pio, who died in 1968, we have incredible accounts of his bilocations. He was popping around all over the world, and he was supposed to stay in San Giovanni Rotonda all the time because he was basically not very well, and they didn't like him going off all over the place. So, but he did. He turned up in New York, everywhere. And but he had the stigmata for 50 years, bleeding the wounds of Christ. He performed miracles. One of my favorite ones, he had this lovely policeman that was looking after him because at one point the crowds got too much, and he said to the policeman, look, you better go home for the week. He said, because next week you're going to die. And the policeman said, but I feel great. He said, don't worry, you'll feel even better next week. So I kind of love that, because he was just like saying, don't worry about it, it's going to happen. But he said, go and put your affairs in order, and have a good heart, you'll be okay. The other one is Teresa Newman. She only ate the Eucharist for 12 years. And everyone said, well, what are you eating? She said, well, I'm living on light. Remember those photons and the waves? Well, let's bring that into another dynamic here. But science at the moment isn't able to have these questions because it's stuck in its own woo. That's the best way to put it. My favorite group is the mystical elders of Mount Athos, otherwise known as the invisible elders. I've written about these in the Restorative Spirit, and I got fascinated with them because they would just turn up unexpectedly, long beards, no clothes but a loincloth, and giving very obscure messages to people and then disappearing to atheists, young monks, bird watchers, artists, you name it, and even fellow monks. My favorite one was a young novice who was, and I've told this story before, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but it's so powerful. A young novice was in a narthex. He was just 19 years old. He wanted to become a hermit. He was praying in the evening. They went right through the night, these guys. In comes a naked guy, blessing all the icons, and then leaves. He runs after him up the hill, jumps in front of him and said, will you be my elder? And this beautiful being said, I'm afraid you couldn't live where we live. You can only live there by grace alone. And he said, but you go back to your elder in the monastery and prepare yourself, because you'll be dead in 2 weeks. And he said, just get yourself prepared. and the graces will be there. So this guy went back. His elder in the monastery said, right, let's get you prepared. 2 weeks later, he died, and the most beautiful smell of flowers around his funeral. So something about life, death, birth and rebirth and all that in this I adore. But Elder Paisios, who died in 1995, is a saint now. He said he used to meet with these mystical elders. I mean, no one knew where they lived, but he would meet with them every 5 years. And he said they would not wish to be glorified in the way that I could go if I want, because I'm fascinated by it. But he said their whole reason for existing is to pray for the world. Now, I think there's something instructive in that, because the praying for the world means, you've got a bigger vision for what we could be. And these guys, obviously their selflessness meant they probably progressed in some way to these cities, and they were giving us teachings back. So, there's a few more examples. But that non-local connection then, so these beings that can bilocate, this is a connection of non-locality. The bit I'd like to put in is, why can't we make non-locality a connection to the holy? Not just physics, not just particles and waves and what have you, but this is about the holy. That's something that we've given up and let go of in some ways, that we're trying to restore and reclaim. And remember Pauli's dream, that there's going to be a return of the soul to the world. And I think this is the work, and this is what these byproducts of these cities are fantastic. But the work is to pray and to work and develop ourselves and grow our spirits in interesting ways. Awakening interconnectivity with a sacred resonance, soul filled with spirit, grace given, things like that. So the position I'm coming from then is all life is ensouled. So we're looking at a soulful universe. And if we think about that as a holon, that the holes that exist within the holes, think of, let's say, Russian dolls, the holes within the hole. And a wonderful way to look at that is, think about each of us has a soul, unless, the Buddhists talk about the anatman, they don't go with the atman. But when you look at awakened consciousness, who's to say at that level what it is? Some people might say, well, it's a soul, and other might just say, well, it's an enlightened consciousness. But this idea, though, that each individual has an anima, and that soul connection, that inner soul connection. And Marie-Louise von France, Jung's great contemporary, she used to talk about the anthropos, the group soul. So then coming into harmony with others and connecting and finding that connection at an ensouled level in the ways that we connect with others. And then our connection to the world, the anima mundi, the ensouledness of trees and plants and rocks and minerals and all the other beings that coexist with us. And then, of course, the anima cosmos, the universe, the universal soul. So that you can see these nested, ensouled elements in these Russian doll, so that we're not just isolated souls. We're always connected and interconnected at a soul level. The question is, this enantiodromia that I spoke about at the beginning, when we think about the increase in extreme states and the enantiodromia that's happening, this shift, what's it shifting to? Well, that's, yes, a transformational consciousness, but I think one that's tangible is a shift to soul progression. So then we can live with this ensouled view with each other and really go deeper with that in an ensouled way. And the Hopi Indians, they call this time that we're living in the Great Purification. And so I think there's something about our work. I certainly still doing that work. I'm still, messed up and getting caught up in things that I then have to come back and work on again and again and again. But it's part of the work, and I don't begrudge it, because that's what I signed up to, I believe, when I came into this incarnation. But the people that remind us of this are the elders, particularly in indigenous conditions, cultures and traditions, and the spiritual traditions that have elders that remember that all life is holy. And, that this is a sacramental incarnation that we have, and that somehow moving through this sacramentally is about deepening and purifying ourselves to be more ensouled with all of nature and with all beings that we come into contact with. So this is where so elders are a noun. That's a name we give to someone. And I've came up with this idea of co-eldering because I like verbs, I like action. So let's have a look at what a co-elder looks like, and to find out what that brings to the mix. I got inspired, well, quite some time now around near-death experiences and the life review. When people have a life review after near-death experiences, there's often a time where they then see panoramically the consequences of the actions that they committed in life, the key ones, probably not every action. What it says to me, so imagine if one of you punched me in the face and I was traumatized for the rest of my life and I couldn't go out in public again. Let's say that. You went on and went off and had a great life and never thought of me again. But when you died, you felt my pain, or vice versa. I did it to you and I felt your pain. Where is that information held? Well, now we get this idea of the quantum field, the Akashic records, if you wish, the quantum field, that it has a retention of knowledge, a retention of knowing, and there's an accountability, there's a karmic consequence. So with the life reviews, I got really excited with this because it made me start thinking about all these religions that talk about the golden rule, you know, that we treat each other, animals, nature, as being sacred and caring for them. I also developed about 2% of people who have near-death experiences have a life preview where they get a shot of things that might be happening for them. It's rare, very rare, but it's often predicted and, if you wish, prophesized. I then developed that and thought, well, hang on a minute. If I hadn't had a near-death experience, but I'm sensitive to the idea of a life review, and life previews can exist, why don't I start creating a life preview for myself to start looking at thinking about karmic offsetting for all the things that I've done in the past, which maybe aren't so good, and start thinking about how I can rearrange my life and start to work for a much more deeper soul progression. So karma informed action, karma yoga. So I'd like to think then that co-eldering is an immersion and an initiation which honors the spirit of the depths, which Jung spoke about at the beginning, which I mentioned. And I like to call that connecting to our eco-mystical potential and participation. And so it brings this sense of the holy really into our scope for living right now. And no half measures. We know what we've got to do. This is up to all of us. The other thing as well is when we do that, we can have these really beautiful connections with the numinous, and sometimes not so beautiful. Sometimes they can be incredibly painful and sharp and dreadful. They're called the mysterium tremendum when it's a tough one, and the mysterium fascinans, or when it's a beautiful one. So the numinous is a good sort of barometer for helping us to really wake up. And so even in those interactions, I've noticed that if I worked with people and there's a real sense of connection in that work, something numinous happens, something incredible wafts into that interaction. And as co-elders, we can be sensitive to that. You know, it might be that I'm helping someone in the first instance. A good friend of mine sent me a dream and just said, hey, have you got a take on this? So I listened to it at 5 o'clock this morning, writing down some notes. And I said, well, that's where I'm going. What do you think? And then we'll have a little backwards and forwards with that, you know? And he'd do the same for me. That's co-eldering. It's nothing too mystical. Well, it is, but it's doable. It's actually got all the mystery embedded in it. But those numinous elements can pop up. We can't control the numinous. It comes unbidden, as Jung said. But when we engage with depth, the numinous can appear, and then we're enriched by it. Then our consciousness is expanding. So thinking then about blah, 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 where am I? The co-eldering as deep collaboration. That's where I'm going with this. This is deep collaboration between people, within a person and between people and between nature, our contact with nature. So inspiring, supporting, sharing each other's transformational journeys, drawing on the innate and ancestral wisdom that is so part of who we are. This isn't just, and we know that from Jung's work, this is integral. It's not secondary or It's right there. We have this. We all know that. And remember that Jung, while we talked about psychiatry at the beginning, Jung's whole emphasis for this work was he wasn't really that tuned into wanting to get into pathologizing, working on pathologies. His whole reason for existing was to bring people to an experience of the numinous. That's what his work was all about. So when you read Jung, always have that in your mind. That's really where he's coming from. So this is what I'd call this co-eldering, is a time of sacred rebirth, if you wish, and that sacred connection, rebirthing that sacred connection. And that two things can happen with that, particularly when we're looking at these powerful forces in consciousness, is an examination and an illumination of consciousness and conscience. An examination of conscience and an illumination of conscience. Things then get seen, and then we can work with those things. So like I said at the beginning, in 86, when I went through my spiritual crisis, I saw some pretty unsavory things in my psyche, and I had to work with that. You know, that was an examination and an illumination of what had hitherto not been seen in that way before. But if we're talking about rebirth, then surely we have to think about the whole idea of, well, what's the dynamic of that? And I've come up with some thoughts around that in the restorative spirit, that we can think about the first element if we think about birth. And obviously I've not been there in this lifetime, but I have seen births. So we get a contraction. Well, what's contracting? I'd like to think that it's a moral contraction that we start with. We start to look at our moral compass for living, our moral parameters, our moral exchanges, and whether they're correct. That's part of our purificationary processes. Jung had a great dream of a businessman that came to him with dirty hands. He had a dream of having dirty hands. And Jung was just pretty much, well, what needs cleaning up? And this guy would have been involved in some rather shady business deals, and straight away realized he had to clean that up and get out of those business deals. That's the way the moral contraction happens through dreams, for instance. The next thing is a mystical expansion. So we've had that contraction where we're actually working in the contraction. That's shadow work. Then there's the mystical expansion where we then start to open up, and the sacred awakening, the numinous comes in, the little shaft of light or the shudder that gives us another orientation for trusting the process. And if we're co-eldering, it means we're joining hands and going with each other further into this work. Healing our splits and projections is what I'm talking about, but also going further into wholeness. I've got a couple of minutes, so I won't be long. The next thing I want to talk about is the way of sacred alignment. I've come up with a word. If there's no word that exists, I make one up. So transformacene is a word I made up. Co-eldering is an idea I had, and this one is one I made up. It's called doulamancy. A doulamancer is someone who, we know what a doula is. A doula helps people around times of birth and death, so entering and exiting this life. Doulas are great. But what about sacred awakening? Doulas for sacred awakening. We could be that for each other as co-elders. Mantic means to divine the deep meaning that happens through dreams, embodied ways of knowing, synchronicities, prophecies, revelations, all those things. That's the doulamancer, birthing through these processes that are popping up. And that, in my estimation, is a path of deep learning. This is deep learning, where we're the eternal students of the soul, if you wish. We're not the masters of it all and the big cheese. We're doing the inner work and the outer work, but that then forms the great work. And if anyone's read Thomas Berry, The Great Work, I highly recommend it if you haven't. Fantastic book. He was a monk, and he was one of the real drivers of ecology, and really, you know, he saw carbon as spiritual. You know, this guy was brilliant. But he said there's four things we need to remember: the feminine, indigenous wisdom, science, and the world religions. He said, let's not leave them out of the picture. These are key for the great work. So let's draw on all these different great traditions. So in that way, co-eldering then is collaborative and it's co-creative. It's working for the greater good and being in service, sacred service, for an improved and sustainable future. That's really what we can do through co-eldering. It's not really something you can get a qualification in. It's something, if you've got some heart, you just want to do it for yourself, and you'll do it for your neighbor. And if someone's in distress, you'll go and listen to them and you'll be with them. That's how I see it. So the sacramental processes then that we can practices that we can get into that support that is opening our hearts, quietening our minds, and enlightening our souls. You know, these are really key elements within this. We can do that through dream work, vision quests, prayer, contemplation, dance, singing, all the things that open us up and bring this gift, this giftedness into life. So I'd say that co-eldering then is a collective pilgrimage into the living mystery of the transformer scene, which is restoring ourselves and each other to wholeness. That's really where I think this talk's been going. There's no destination, there's only a vibration, and that vibration is love, living prayerfully and love in action. And I'll just finish up because we've got a little bit of time then for some questions or some reflections if anyone wants to. I would suggest that without the deep transformation that I've presented tonight, in terms of our conscience and our consciousness, our individualistic and materialistic habits will prevail. Because somewhere, unless we're really getting in and shining a light on what we can become, if we're not attending to that, then I can't see any, all of the stuff we do in the change will, you know, in some ways it will filter down to some degree of depth, but we need the depth to create that deepening process to live it. And here's the old wonderful quote to finish with, always attributed to Einstein. I don't know if it is, but let's say it anyway. And if we ever find out who did say it, well, we can correct that in the future talks. But insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And I think that takes a physicist to tell us really what is needed. We need to do things differently. And that starts with us. It starts with each other, and it starts with our relationships and everything that we need to do. And I would like to honor my dear teacher, Arnie Mindell, who I believe actually lived that very impeccably. And there's plenty of great elders around that we can draw on for inspiration. He will be mine forever, as is Jung, as are many other people that do this work. So bless you. Thank you for listening. And I appreciate your ears and hearts. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Mick. I would like to ask everybody to unmute, and let's give Mick a real heartfelt round of applause for what has been an absolutely wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Mick. Brilliant. Very good.
Thank you.
Really enjoyable.
Mick, have you got time for a few questions?
Yeah. I may not be able to answer them, but somebody else might. But I'm up for the. I'm giving it a go.
Up for the challenge. Well, look, I think all of us are going to take some time to process that, and that's the beauty of having a recording. Cheekily, perhaps there's another book left in those ideas that you've presented. I don't know. Or perhaps it's somebody else to pick that up. Let me try and, I probably ask the same question every night, Mick, to all of the people presenting in different ways. There was so much of that really resonated with me in being in this fabric or this matrix or this web of interconnection, and how what happens in my experience has the potential to send out ripples and let's say energy out there and affect and touch and move other people. And, you know, we only have to put the television on or listen to the radio or go on the internet to see so much chaos and, as you said earlier, crisis going on in the world today. It can sometimes feel perhaps a little bit overwhelming. How do I possibly start to make some impacts in that? And I just wondered if there's, and I say this quite honestly as a person that experiences that and feels that on a regular basis, I just wondered if, you know, from everything that you've shared and from this point of co-eldering, are there perhaps some bits of words of wisdom that you could share there for us?
Well, I suppose the first thing that pops up is you mentioned the word matrix, which of course means mother. And I remember when I was working through some remnants of my old extreme state with the wonderful Jean-Claude Ordegon, and he was a wonderful teacher. And he said, yeah, just go into your body. I was still reverberating, even though I was some years after the experience, and I was still reverberating with that pain of that experience. It really was a deep, deep shocker, that one. It took me, it still is integrating it in some ways. And he said, I had a little shake in my hand, and I said, oh, and he said, go further with it. So we embodied that. This is the way Mindell works. And Jean-Claude was a student of Arnie, well, co-producer of Process Work. And he said, well, amplify that, a Jungian term. So I made the whole body go shaky. And then I got this sense of a cobra, a big snake like that. And it was so potent. It rather than suffering from a symptom, it transformed into something which was available energetically for living. And he said, now strike for your individuation. Strike. And he said, afterwards, I thought, whoa, what a gift. What a gift. Strike for your individuation. Go for it. Don't hold back and just only suffer. Pick this up. And when you said matrix, and I thought mother, what he said to me was, and mother all of your experiences. And I thought, oh, that was such a beautiful thing to say. And so I don't know if that's the right answer, but I certainly learned from that. I did one this morning. I was having a bit of a wobble this morning. And that symbol there, I stood in the door, and I imagined holding a trident, and it totally changed my whole being. And I thought, we got the wave function, the soul, Poseidon, and Shiva coming through this. And I thought, woohoo, totally changed. I mean, we can engage with ourselves and make a difference in ourselves and with each other. So, yeah, I think we can do it.
Beautifully.
So we ain't going to crash at times. Of course we are. But if we're there for each other, then I think that, that can help as well. That's co-eldering in my view.
Oh, bless you. Thank you ever so much. Please, I invite everybody who wants to either put your hand up, put your microphone on, and ask Mick a question now. This is your chance. Romy, please.
Or not.
Or not.
Hello. Thank you so much. I absolutely love that. I don't really know if it's I don't have a question. Or maybe I do.
But it's like particle wave duality. Is it a question?
Yeah, exactly.
Or is it? So
that's normally how I roll all the time. I'm in constant sync or out of sync.
Lovely.
But when you were talking, especially now when you were talking about mothering all your experiences, and I had this beautiful warmth, and how at the moment, when within the school system, let's say, how we are sort of stripping out all the creative arts, the drama, the music, the sort of the dance, and how impactful that is within our psyche and within our spirituality. I mean, I trained years ago. As I went to drama school, so I trained as an actress, and a lot of the and I'm a therapist as well, and a lot of the actual therapy that I do, a lot of it is based within the drama and the lessons and the embodiments that I actually learned through that. There's such a strong link, and the embodiment of certain movements and the expression of emotions, the moving through your whole body, the nervous system, everything, and yet that is so, we're just pulling that apart, and there's so much distraction now with technology and the news and all these different sitcoms and programs. It's almost like everything is things are geared towards keeping us surface level, rather than actually allowing us to go deeper. And it's almost like there are two agendas that are playing, possibly more agendas, but very strong shadow side and light side. And one of the things that I wanted to mention was, a little while ago, I was working for a charity, and I found that there was a lot of friction and a lot of tension. It's almost like there was one side that I saw the dark side, another side I saw the light side, and they just kept bashing heads, but no one was going anywhere. And I suddenly thought, well, the dark always overtakes the light. It's sort of almost, you almost get lost in it. But I thought if the light turned away from the dark and just focused on the light, all of a sudden it gets bigger and bigger and more expansive. And so I thought, so what is the point of doing that when you can actually then just turn inwards and all of a sudden you'll be expanding? And I remember talking to this, to a few people, and they sort of looked at me as if I was a bit crazy. But I actually think with everything that you're talking about, there are so many different parallels within that. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on my rather crazy thoughts.
I think you're absolutely right. And I agree with everything you're saying, that it's just, there is, I think, I don't know whether it's a conscious agenda, but there's definitely an attempt to just, remove all these incredible things like the arts and in universities and stuff. And like you say, the entertainment culture that just.
What, dear? Much earlier.
But the idea is that somehow it being only in opposition to that. I'm thinking about Arnie here. In his book Sitting in the Fire, he's facilitating in Northern Ireland to two people that were on different sides of the fence in the conflict, and it was getting really hot. And Arnie didn't do an intervention that would be rational, which is why I love him. He said one of them, he noticed that someone's carotid artery was hanging out and that they were going red. And the guy stopped and said, I not long ago had a heart attack. I better slow down. But the person he was shouting at, and they were shouting at each other, said, yeah, I've had one of them too. And then they met around the heart and taking care of the heart. So in fact, there's some really crazy ways that we might even think about not only turning. I think sometimes we do need to turn away and replenish ourselves and connect with like-minded souls. But other times it's also about pointing out things. I mean, I remember being at the university and, sometimes people would have a little bit of fun with me because they knew what I was into. And we had some great discussions. And in the end, I had someone who used to have some deep conversations with me, ended up helping one of his family members make a contribution into the book, the first book I wrote. And so I know somewhere that it was valued, I mean, obviously I can't say names and places and stuff, but there was just a beautiful symmetry to that what seemed a little bit antagonistic or not understanding actually had a real powerful resonance when we had a story that connected. So I think stories are really important. And even though people might want to get them out of the curriculum, we can be storytellers.
Yeah, definitely.
Story facilitators. So I think that, somewhere, think of Arnie's pointing out someone's red neck, Beautiful story.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you.
Natalie, I noticed another hand up there, please.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Mick.
Hi, Nat.
Nice to see you.
And you.
I'm fine. From a metaphysical perspective, who was the fly that was flying around you when you started the talk? You're silenced.
Sorry.
There we are. Yes. Who knows? It could have been Arnie, couldn't it? What do you think?
I don't know. I thought it was a bit weird just at the beginning where you were mentioning him.
I didn't see it. So was it around my head?
Both sides of your head.
Oh my God. Oh, well, there you go. There he is. I'll bring him in. Yeah. What a dude. What a dude. Yeah, I think that was Arnie. It would fit. Wouldn't it, Zelda? Yeah. No, nice one. That well observed. I didn't see it, but I didn't even feel it, which is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it too, Mick, and I did wonder.
Did you?
Yes.
Brilliant. Oh, lovely. Oh, lovely. Oh, well, thanks, Arnie. Thanks for showing up. I did actually ask him to pop in.
Jeanette.
I maybe
Oh,
a
hello,
bit
Jeanette.
tangential. Hiya, hiya.
Hello.
Great talk,
Oh, thank you.
as always.
Oh, bless you.
I wondered whether you can say anything about a possible role for psychedelics in moving things forward, connecting things, changing our inner world and how we relate to the outer world.
Well, I feel very humble even daring to mention that question to you because I know how well connected you are in that field. I've never done psychedelics, although I did have some very strong stuff once that I nearly jumped out of a window, so I never did it again. But but that's just me because I'm a little bit loose anyway, so that sort of just tipped me over the edge. But coming back to it, I think there is a role for that, and but I don't have enough knowledge or experience to comment. But from what I know from listening, well, I mean, you've set up some amazing talks with Cambridge Consciousness Forum, and I've listened to those and participated in those and learnt a lot. And I would suggest from what I've heard from great speakers like Maria Papp and Chris Beisch and others, that this is something that could really help us. On the other hand, there is another bit. I remember Ram Dass giving about 4 or 5 very strong LSD tablets to Neem Karoli Baba, and he said, give them to me, and he put the whole lot in his mouth and nothing happened. So I think that enlightened state is something that is, beyond that. But on the way, microdosing might be something that really helps us start to connect. I wouldn't mind betting, from what I've read and the bits I've read. But I'm not very well versed in that milieu, as it were. But what do you think?
Well, I can go into that, but maybe I was thinking we could shift it and go to something that you said you have experience with, is Kundalini. I think all these things get us into alternative states or of consciousness. So it almost doesn't matter whether it's psychedelics or meditation or spontaneous Kundalini awakenings or whatever. So maybe I should rephrase it and say the role of entering non-ordinary states of consciousness.
Definitely. I mean, I think that is part of the enantiodromia that I spoke about at the beginning, that somehow our everyday consensus reality forms and norms need a little bit of loosening up. Now, obviously, when it gets too big, like I had, I mean, I was hanging on by my fingernails for a couple of years, and I managed to just navigate through it because I could be on the dole in them days and not worry about it. Not so easy these days, but I do think that, yes, absolutely right. Those non-ordinary states are part of shifting out of this one-dimensional consciousness into a breakthrough mode to bring about this. And I guess the faith we have to have is that this is productive and going somewhere, and it's not just an illness or something like that, but of course it takes great depth and skill to navigate these things, both individually and between people. We know that, but I do think that this is an exciting part of the work. So yeah, I wholly agree with you, Jeanette. Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, Mick. It's a good talk.
Oh, thank you, Jay. Lovely to see you.
Yeah. May I request Arjuna Disilo, my friend, would like to say something?
Yes.
Hi, Arjuna.
I don't think I'm muted. What, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm listening to you.
How lovely to see your face. Oh my gosh.
Oh.
I'm thinking about Arnie.
Like a reunion.
Yeah, I hadn't heard. Thank you for telling us about Arnie, Mick.
Oh, yeah. Real woke up to that this morning, and I thought I thought it's going to be quite something doing this talk today, and thinking about Arnie, it was quite But yeah, also, you know, he was a real Taoist. He was a real spirit. So, you know, he would have gone, I guess, with, you know, some real awareness.
Oh yeah.
Me and Arjuna had very good time together to learn from Arne Mindell at Seaside in USA. Isn't it, Arjuna?
Yes.
Lovely.
Yes, the very first time I met Arnie, I also met you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, you know, he's quite an incredible spirit.
Yeah, he's with us now.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's flying around.
Jay, we'll stay in touch.
Okay, bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah,
That's
love
lovely.
you.
I like that.
Thank you. Well, perhaps this is conscious of time. Perhaps this is a beautiful place to bring things to a little bit of a close in that spirit of communion and fellowship and friendship that is developing across this week. Once again, can we put our hands together for Mick for a really wonderful and inspiring talk today?
Thank you.
Thank you.